Welcome to the Transform Our World podcast with Ed Silvoso. Ecclesia everyone, every day, everywhere.
Welcome to your edification for the week. One of the biggest puzzles is there any redemptive value in suffering, in trials, in tribulations? So today we're going to address that issue, and we're going to go to someone who knew a lot about suffering, Peter. He tells us in 1 Peter chapter 1, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you," key word, to test you, "as though something strange were happening to you." So let's pause and reflect. Suffering should be embraced as normal in our Christian life. Why? We'll see that in a moment. But let me mention that the underground church in China has 5 drivers. Number 1, the Word of God. Number 2, prayer. Number 3, are you ready? Suffering. They consider that on a par with the other 2. Number 4, evangelism. And number 5, miracles. It's so interesting that suffering is the pivot between the Word and prayer, and between evangelism and signs and wonders. So I hope to show you the value of suffering, and why the underground church in China chose it. So Peter tells us in verse 13, "But instead rejoice, inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ." That sounds like a contradiction. He seems to be saying, the more you suffer, the more you should rejoice. And then he goes on to tell us why. "So that you may be overjoyed." Not just joy, but overjoyed. That means joy over the top. When? When his glory is revealed. To find out how, look at the next verse. "If you are suffering because of the name of Christ, you are blessed." Why? "For the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you while you are suffering." Basically, what this means is that God gives you preferential treatment. When you are suffering, you get a double portion of everything. We learned this through an experience with our daughter Marilyn. She was diagnosed with a very dangerous condition. When I was on the verge of my trip to Argentina, it was a tough decision, but Ruth and I decided that I should go ahead and she will stay with Marilyn, even though her life was hanging in the balance. And for several days, that's what it looked like. But I'll tell you what, during those days, anything that Marilyn wanted, Marilyn got. Anything. Why? Because we knew that she was suffering and we wanted to give her preferential treatment. The interesting thing is, when she got well and discharged, she came home in the old mode and she began to ask for a lot of things, and she got a different reply. Go and get it. What changed? She no longer had the Spirit of glory resting upon her. No special favors, because she wasn't undergoing a difficult situation. So Peter goes on in verse 14 to say, "If you're insulted because of the name of Christ, rejoice because the Spirit rests upon you." Now, if you suffer as a murderer, or a criminal, or a meddler, it doesn't apply. But verse 16 says, "However, if you suffer as a Christian," this is one of the few places in the New Testament where the word Christian is used. "Do you not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name," which means the name of Christ is synonym with suffering under grace. Actually, Christian means little Christ. Cristitos in Spanish, small Christ. So then, Peter adds in verse 19, "Those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good." Key phrase, continue to to do good. Have the right finish line present at all times. Sufferings will make you stronger, not weaker. So we bring up now as a witness to this James, who also suffered, his own share. And he tells us, I'll tell you, if Peter was pushing us, this one pushed us all over the way. He says, 1 James 1, verse 2, consider it pure joy, unadulterated joy, 100% proof joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let that perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. But that will only happen at the end if you persevere. God allows trials and tribulations to come, and they come for a purpose, to make us stronger. But it is our choice to persevere or to quit. And then he goes on to say in verse 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, the person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those that love him. Look how perseverance is the pivot that connects our current suffering with a crown of life. It reminds us of Jesus, who suffered what he suffered for the joy put before him. When tempted, and it's very interesting because here the same word can mean a test or a temptation. Very, very fascinating. So now James switches to temptation. When tempted, verse 13, no one should say, God is tempting me. Because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. And now look at this, how your flesh is the grandmother of death. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Watch out, because you can receive the crown of life, or you can receive the crown of death. And it's the same word. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Test and temptation, same word, different outcome, determined by how we deal with it. So think of a wall clock and picture where the number 12 is. You get the biblical principle now, which tells, you will overcome temptation, or you will overcome tribulation. Now, at 3 o'clock now, a test happens. If you fail the test, you go back to 12 o'clock, and all you have is a principle, but it's untested. But if you pass the test, if you persevere, at 3 o'clock, that principle becomes a conviction. And then that conviction becomes a lifestyle at 9 o'clock. So go back to the wall clock, and 12 o'clock, a principle is given to us. It's powerful, but it's meaningless unless it's tested. And you pass the test at 3 o'clock. Now you know that it's meaningful because it works. It's a conviction. And because it works, you keep using it, and it becomes a lifestyle. Trials and tribulations are not appealing in the natural, but in the scripture we are told that they are for good. So let's go to the story in the book of Daniel of the 3 young men who defied the king. It says in chapter 2 at the very end that the king was so happy with Daniel that he placed him in a high position, verse 48, and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. This was his cabinet, so to speak. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So far, so good. Now cross the border to Daniel chapter 3. And now the king goes south. It says that the king made an image of gold of himself and set it up on the plain of Judah in the province of Babylon. In verse 4, and the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace, according to verse 6. But some astrologers told the king, in verse 12, there are some Jews, these are Daniel's 3 friends, whom you have set out over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you. I mean, they really challenged him, where he was very egotistical about himself. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of God you have set up. Verse 13, furious with rage, the king summoned them, and they were brought before him. And he said to them, is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of God that I have set up? If you do not worship them, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then he bragged. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Big mistake. Because the 3 young men says, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Notice this. They never doubted God's power. He's able to deliver us. But they were not sure that he might deliver them, will deliver them. That's why they say, the God we'll serve is able to do it. Whether he will do it or not, we don't know. But nothing changes. Why is that? Because the king was using fear as a weapon, and that is what the Bible says, that the devil held people in captivity through the fear of death. They said, we don't know what the outcome will be. We don't know if this illness is terminal. We don't know if bankruptcy will hit us tomorrow. We don't know if a car accident will take away a loved one. We don't know that, but this we know. God is able to deliver us from it. That doesn't undermine God's sovereignty and power. But now, whether he does it or not, it doesn't change our attitude. And in verse 18, they said, but even if he does not, which is entirely possible, I will add, see, he's God, not us. We want you to know, your majesty, look how respectful they remain, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. We do not fear you, king, regardless of the outcome. God does not promise us a suffering-free life, but he guarantees us that he will walk alongside, and that all things, pleasant and unpleasant, good and bad, will work together for good according to the purpose that he has for us, one of which is to make us stronger through trials, as we will soon see. Then the king was furious with them, and his attitude toward them changed. And in the following verses, it says that he commanded his strongest soldiers to carry them totally bound, tied up, and throw them into the fiery furnace. And verse 22 tells us that those soldiers that held them captive, they were killed. And the 3 men were thrown tied up, but now the king sees that they are no longer tied up, and he doesn't see 3, he sees 4. And in verse 25, he says, look, I see 4 men walking around, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods, an angel. Pause for a moment. The only 2 things that burned were those that held them captive and the ropes that tied them. My friend, when a trial comes, when a tribulation comes, when fear tries to envelop us, if we take refuge in God, all we lose is the fear. In my own journey, I had 2 totally irrational fears growing up. One was that I will go blind, and I was afraid of that. And the other one is that I will not be able to undergo general anesthesia. So in January of the year 1980, I have to undergo a major surgery, where they split my sternum bone, retracted the rib cage, removed a lot of tissue there. It was a 4-hour-long operation at the Stanford Medical Center. After the doctor explained to me prior to the surgery everything that he was going to do, my fear kicked in, and I said, now, doctor, he said, do you have any questions? Yes, only one. Can you do it under local anesthesia? He looked at me as if I was a Martian. He said, sir, you don't understand. I mean, your heart will be put on a ventilator, okay? We cannot do this under local anesthesia. You see, my fear kicked in. So I have no choice but to take refuge in God and say, God, would you help me? The next morning, as they wheeled me into operation, I asked, don't give me any pre-anesthesia. I want to be awake up to the last minute. I quizzed the doctors, the nurses, the anesthesiologists, everybody, you doing okay? Are you happy? Blah, blah, blah. And finally, I said, okay, begin to count. By the time I counted to 2, I was gone. Several hours later, I woke up. And I was alive. And I realized that today is the tomorrow that I was so afraid of yesterday. You see, I persevere under duress, but I persevere, and God delivered me. So my friend, look what happened in verse 27. They brought them out, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors, these are the most influential people, crowded around them, and they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire in them. And now the king said in verse 28, praise be to the God of these young men, who has sent his angel and rescue his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. This takes us to Revelation 12:11. And they overcame him, the devil, the one who holds people captive through the fear of death. He delivered us by the blood of the Lamb, the word of our testimony, and because we despise our lives even unto death. And now the king signed a decree, verse 29. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language, these are the same people that he commanded them to worship the statue that these 3 men chose none to, who say anything against the God of these men, be cut into pieces, and their houses be buried, be turned into pieces of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Hallelujah. And then the king promoted them in the province of Babylon. In conclusion, my friends, our greatest example is Jesus. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9 says, but we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while in his human form, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. He tasted it for us to show us the way that there is a death, but there is a resurrection. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should never make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them, to call us, his brothers, his sisters, to let us bear the name of Christians. And then he says, I will declare your name. In the assembly, I will sing your praises. Do you realize that when you're undergoing tribulations and suffering and you persevere, the Lord confesses you before the angels. The Lord sings praises in heaven. And your name is in the lyrics of that song. And verse 13 of Hebrews 2 says, I will put my trust in him, says Jesus. Here I am, and the children God has given me. The Spirit of God and of glory resting upon you during trials sets in motion a praise and worship service in heaven, and in the meantime you get preferential treatment. And then it concludes, since the children have flesh and blood, he too, Jesus, shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. In conclusion, the devil cannot kill you, but he can torture you with the fear of death. That's what the king did. He says, hey, I'm going to do this to you. They said, no. Whether you do it or not is immaterial. We will not fear you. And I close with this example. There was a season in my life after we broke through in Resistencia, and God used us to defeat San La Muerte, Saint Death, the spirit of death over that city, that unexpectedly I was hit with tremendous fear of death. It didn't make any sense, because prior to that, when I was fighting a 2-year life expectancy, I faced death every day, and not once I fear. And now that we brought down San La Muerte, Saint Death, I am just tormented by the fear of death. I will go into hyperventilation. My pulse will be out of control. I'll be shaking. It didn't make any sense. I went to every doctor I was recommended. I underwent treatments. Nothing went well. Until one day I'm on my knees, and I said to the devil, let's have a chat. I know you cannot kill me, but let me grant you, for the sake of argument, that you could. If you kill me, what is the worst that can happen to me? I'll be ushered into the presence of God. And at that moment, that bubble, that's all it was, a bubble, the fear of death, pop. And I was set free from the fear of death, because I called the devil's bluff. My friend, whatever you are going through today is for a purpose. And as you are suffering, God allows his Spirit to rest upon you and gives you preferential treatment, because the angel of the Lord encamps around you. And while you are learning to persevere, so that you will know that you lack nothing, listen to this. Jesus is leading a praise and worship service in heaven, and your name is in the lyrics that he's singing, because he says, I am not ashamed to call you my brother, my sister, because you are suffering as a Christian. God bless you.
Thank you for listening to today's edition of the Transform Our World podcast with Ed Silvoso. Ecclesia everyone, every day, everywhere. We invite you to make your own home an ecclesia, a place where the presence and power of the Lord Jesus dwells every day. Then visit us at transformourworld.org or Ecclesia Everywhere on Facebook to join a massive movement of believers who are changing our world for the better, because it really is God's time for you, your family, your neighborhood, and nation.